In the early 16th century, the seas of Europe were not just simple trade routes. They were battlegrounds where the fate of nations was at stake and the ambitions of explorers clashed. Spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg. These small grains held a value comparable to gold at the time. European royalty and merchants kept each other in check to obtain this spice, sending countless ships to sea in search of new routes. At the center of it all was the Spice Islands, known today as the Maluku Islands. The balance of power in the world could shift depending on who first claimed these small islands. In that chaotic era, a man was quietly trying to change the course of history: Ferdinand Magellan. He was a loyal navigator of the Portuguese kingdom, but he was increasingly being pushed aside due to injuries from war and political conflicts. He sailed across the Indian Ocean and along the African coast, accumulating more sailing experience than anyone else, but his homeland did not recognize his abilities. Instead, his proposals were ignored, and his loyalty was questioned. Magellan explained the possibilities of new routes to the Portuguese king several times. "Your Majesty, the earth is round. If you head west, you will surely reach the east." But what returned was only cynicism and mockery. Portugal had already taken control of the route to the Indian Ocean by going around Africa, and they thought there was no reason to seek a new path. Magellan's hypothesis was risky, and the chances of success seemed slim. In the end, he makes a decision. "I will leave a country that does not believe in me." He quietly turns his back on Portugal and heads to Spain. This was not just a simple defection, but a choice that was almost treasonous by the standards of the time. Portugal and Spain were rivals that kept each other in check, and navigation technology was close to a state secret. Nevertheless, Magellan risked everything for his beliefs. Upon arriving in Spain, he made his final gamble in front of the young monarch Charles V. He carefully explained his conviction that the earth is round, the calculations that if one heads west, they will inevitably reach the Maluku Islands, and the strategic value of being able to bypass the eastern route controlled by Portugal. Charles V was initially skeptical, but he saw an unwavering conviction in Magellan's eyes. And above all, the possibility that this could be a new opportunity to contain Portugal moved his heart. Thus, Spain decided to entrust the fleet to Magellan. 5 ships, 270 crew members, and preparations heading towards the endless sea. This voyage was not just a simple exploration. It was a huge gamble involving the pride of the nation, economic interests, and the knowledge of humanity. But Magellan was not afraid. In his heart, there was only one conviction: the earth is round, and I set out to prove it. He knew that he might fail. But even if he failed, he believed that someone had to open this path. That belief moved him, and it ultimately led him toward the historic moment of the first circumnavigation of the earth. And in 1519, at the moment the fleet set sail from the port of Seville, Magellan's gamble began. The place he headed to was a path not on the map, a sea no one had ever visited, and a truth that humanity had yet to prove. In the autumn of 1519, 5 ships departed from the port of Seville, slowly making their way into the Atlantic, leaving behind Spain's last horizon. The moment of departure was grand, but that grandeur did not last long. The sea soon began to test Magellan's ambitions. The waves of the Atlantic crashed against the fleet like a massive wall, and the storm raged as if it would tear the sails of the ships apart. The crew had to continuously bail water day and night to keep the ship afloat. To them, the sea was not just a natural element, but felt like a living monster. But the real danger on this voyage was not outside, but inside the ship. Magellan was of Portuguese origin, and most of the captains were Spanish nobles. They referred to Magellan as a foreigner and did not recognize his authority. Although there were complaints before departure, as the storm and hard labor continued, those complaints gradually turned into overt hostility. Why should we follow the orders of the Portuguese? Does he even know where he is leading us? Such whispers spread like poison in the hearts of the crew. Magellan was a navigator superior to anyone else, but his political base was weak. His orders were often ignored, and Spanish captains conspired against him to keep him in check. When the fleet arrived at the South American coast, the situation worsened. A land that does not exist on the map, an endlessly extending coastline, and a passage that is nowhere to be seen. Magellan believed that there must be a way across the continent, but the sailors' patience was already reaching its limit. As the harsh cold set in, the fleet had to winter at the southern tip of South America. The freezing wind seeped through the cracks of the ship, and the food supply was dwindling rapidly. The crew endured hunger and cold, relying on each other's body heat, waiting only for the day they could leave again. However, the waiting fueled anxiety and fear, and eventually, some captains staged a rebellion. That night, the wind was particularly strong, and the darkness was deep. The rebels tried to undermine Magellan's authority and seize control of the fleet. However, Magellan was resolute. He risked his life to suppress the rebellion, reclaimed the ship, and restored order to the Voyage. In the process, blood was shed, and several captains were executed or imprisoned. The fleet left deep wounds, but no one could deny it. Magellan was an unwavering leader. Even after the rebellion was suppressed, the suffering did not end. The South American coast stretched endlessly, and the passage was nowhere to be seen. In the harsh cold, the crew had to repair the ship, conserve food, and prepare to set sail again. They did not know where they were going or if this voyage could really be successful. But Magellan did not give up. Every night, he observed the stars, read the direction of the wind, and analyzed the terrain of the continent. His gaze was still unwavering, and one day, he makes a decision. We will continue to move towards the southern end. There will definitely be a way. The crew was anxious, but Magellan's confidence moved them to act again. They raised the sails once more and set out to sea again. What they did not know was that at the end of that road, a new sea awaited, which humanity would encounter for the first time. In 1520, the fleet continued to sail towards the southern tip of the South American continent. The endless coastline, the freezing winds, and the lands that were not on the map. The crew grew increasingly weary, and Magellan's resolve became even stronger. He believed, there is a road somewhere on this continent that connects the east and the west. However, that road has never revealed itself easily. The coastline was intricately curved, and the wind changed direction every day, tormenting the ships. The crew's hands and feet froze in the bitter cold, and the ship's sails and ropes split in the icy wind. Every day, they bailed out water, broke the frozen deck, and grew weary from the endless voyage. Then one day, the fleet discovered a narrow waterway beneath a massive mountain range. On both sides, steep cliffs rose up, and the waterway was deep and dark. The wind howled as it squeezed through the gaps, and the waves crashed irregularly. The crew trembled in fear. That place is a road only for the mad. If you go in there, you will never come back. But Magellan quietly said while looking at the waterway, that is the very path we have been searching for. He stood at the forefront and led the ship. The waterway twisted and turned like a maze, with countless small islands scattered around. The wind suddenly changed direction, pushing the ship sideways, and the reefs jutted sharply from beneath the surface. Even a small mistake could have shattered the ship into pieces. The fleet cautiously and persistently passed through the unknown path. At night, Moonlight seeped through the cliffs, faintly illuminating the waterway, and during the day, the wind suddenly intensified, shaking the ship. The crew had to fight for survival at every moment. However, the biggest shock during this perilous journey was the departure of the San Antonio. The San Antonio, the largest and most important ship in the fleet, was loaded with food and supplies. But one morning, the ship disappeared without a trace. Magellan immediately ordered a search, but the San Antonio had already fled. The Spanish captains rebelled, seized the ship, and returned to Portugal. The remaining crew members were in despair. Food supplies were dwindling, the voyage had become more dangerous, and no one knew what awaited them ahead. But Magellan remained unshaken. He repaired the remaining boats and moved forward again. His gaze was still filled with conviction. We will definitely pass through this path, and they will reach a new sea. And finally, they will face a completely different sea at the end of that path. Unlike the storms they have experienced so far, it is a calm, serene, and endlessly vast blue sea. Magellan looked at the sea and quietly said, "Pacifico, the peaceful sea." At that moment, humanity reached the Pacific Ocean for the first time, and Magellan was the first to open up the path. He was searching for the narrow and treacherous waterway that divides the continents, now known as the Strait of Magellan. They did not yet know that this calm sea would soon bring them the most brutal trials, the Pacific. This sea, named directly by Magellan, was initially so calm that it was hard to believe. In contrast to the stormy Atlantic, the waves were gentle and the wind was soft. The sailors felt as if the gods had granted them a moment of rest. However, that tranquility did not last long. This vast ocean began to test them in a way more brutal than any storm. The expanse of the Pacific Ocean far exceeded what Europeans could imagine at the time. A space that does not exist on the map, a horizon that seems endless, and islands that are nowhere to be seen. The fleet seemed to drift in an endless void. Food supplies dwindled quickly. At first, the crew rationed their hardtack and dried meat, but after a few weeks, all that was left was rotten water and biscuits crawling with bugs. When that ran out, they boiled leather scraps to eat, caught and ate rats, and even chewed on sawdust. Scurvy began to gnaw at the sailors' bodies, their gums swollen and bleeding, and their legs losing strength. How much further do we have to go? No one could answer. The Pacific answered them only in silence. 99 days. They endured nearly 100 days on the sea. During that time, dozens died, and the survivors continued to sail, supporting each other with their skeletal bodies. However, at the end of that despair, the small islands finally revealed themselves. That place was the Philippine archipelago of today. The indigenous people of the Philippines were initially wary, but they provided Magellan and his crew with water and food. The starving sailors, who were dying from hunger and illness, shed tears as they ate warm food after a long time. Magellan preached Catholicism to them, and some tribes accepted his authority. He believed that he could form new alliances here. However, that belief soon leads to tragedy. Mactan Island, the chieftain Lapu-Lapu, there rejected Spanish influence. He declared that he would not succumb to external forces, and Magellan attempted to resolve this by force under the pretext of establishing order. However, he did not properly understand the terrain of this land or the methods of combat. On the dawn of April 27, 1521, Magellan landed on Mactan Island with a force of about 60 men. However, what awaited them was a massive army of 1,500 warriors, led by Lapu-Lapu. The battle was unfavorable from the start. The European-style armor was bogged down in mud, and rocks and guns and cannons could not be used effectively near the water. In contrast, the natives had a perfect understanding of the terrain, and continuously launched attacks with spears and arrows. Magellan did not retreat until the end. He fought at the forefront, encouraging his soldiers, and moved forward shouting his name. However, in the end, he was pierced by dozens of spears and fell. His body was submerged in the sea, and his last breath disappeared into the waves. The fleet, having lost its commander, fell into chaos. The crew had to hurriedly return to the ship and flee. Unable to even recover Magellan's body, they now had to continue their voyage just to survive, without a leader, food, or clear goals. Magellan is dead, but the voyage he started is not yet over, and the remaining crew members had to set out to sea again, to complete the final journey he could not achieve. After Magellan collapsed in Mactan, the fleet fell into chaos, having lost its leader. They had to leave the island in a hurry without even retrieving his body, and the crew members could only look at each other's faces in deep loss and fear. They were no longer Magellan's fleet. It was like refugees who had to rely on each other just to survive. However, the voyage was not over. The journey that Magellan began was still unfinished, and the goal he sought to achieve in his lifetime, a journey around the world that heads west to reach the east, and then returns west, was something that someone had to complete. At that moment, a figure quietly stepped forward. Juan Sebastián Elcano, an experienced navigator from Spain. He was a figure who had not received much attention, overshadowed by Magellan. However, he was cooler than anyone else, and clearly knew what the fleet needed to do now. Elcano gathered the remaining crew members and said, "We must go back. If we return to Spain with the spices, this voyage will not be a failure but a historic victory." His words rekindled a small spark in the hearts of the sailors. They had lost Magellan, but there was still hope that they could fulfill his dream. The fleet set sail again. However, the situation was desperate. Only 3 ships remained. Food was scarce, and Portugal considered them enemies. Even when they arrived in the Molucca Islands and secured the spices, their anxiety outweighed their joy. This was because they now had to avoid the Portuguese surveillance and navigate around the Indian Ocean and the southern tip of Africa to return to Spain. In the end, Elcano makes a decision. 2 out of the 3 ships were too damaged to sail, and the remaining 1, the Victoria, was their only hope. They loaded the Victoria with spices and set sail into the Indian Ocean to evade the Portuguese pursuit. This return voyage was as harsh as Magellan's crossing of the Pacific. The storm did not cease, and disease and hunger once again plagued the sailors. The Portuguese fleet pursued them from all directions, forcing them to sail only at night, or hide behind islands for days to avoid detection. When rounding the southern tip of Africa, the winds were so fierce that the ship nearly capsized, and the sailors held onto each other and prayed to endure. They were already bodies with nothing but bones left, and their minds were reaching their limits. However, Elcano did not give up. Every night he looked at the stars to find his direction, and told the crew not to lose hope until the very end. And on September 6, 1522, the Victoria finally appeared in the port of Sanlúcar, Spain. Of the 270 crew members who set sail, only 18 returned alive. They came down from the ship, dressed in rags and utterly exhausted. However, their gaze contained a deep conviction that only those who know what they have achieved can possess. While they were organizing the logbook, an astonishing fact was revealed. They had certainly kept records without missing a single day, But upon returning to Spain and checking the dates, there was a discrepancy of one day. At that moment, humanity realized for the first time, the Earth is round, and if you keep going west, you can return from the east, and that the date changes after one complete trip around the Earth. Magellan did not witness that moment, but the voyage he started was eventually completed. His name was recorded only after his death, as the explorer who led humanity's first circumnavigation of the globe. And on the day the Victoria Harbor was docked, humanity obtained evidence for the first time that the Earth is round.